sweet. Reminds me of when we were interloping on Spanish territory, cutting logwood. Did that happen or not? Maybe. You never know. I always open these videos with that melancholy tune, whenever you can expect some sort of heavy discussion. For some months now, I have kind of dedicated the channel to covering the Buccaneers, a group which even the mighty Wikipedia struggles to narrowly define, which kind of gives you a hint to the ride we're going on. The word Buccaneer has become synonymous with pirate, but the historians who dabble seriously into their history recognize the Buccaneers as a phenomenon unique to their particular time and geographical region. If one word cannot be defined as a synonym, that usually warrants the word as something entirely unique. And such is the case for the Buccaneers. They are usually discussed as an offshoot of pirates, only really recognized as less important or interesting than the names of Blackbeard, Henry Every, John Rackham, and Bartholomew Roberts. Strangely enough, those pirates were all small potatoes compared to the Buccaneers. Their feats at sea were child's play in comparison to what the Buccaneers did. Blackbeard, stole a few ships, good enough. The Buccaneers looted entire cities. When you look at the timeline defined as the Golden Age of piracy, usually ranging somewhere between 1630 to 1730, the Age of Buccaneers took up almost 70 years of the time frame. 70 years is quite a bit, isn't it? It's definitely more fingers than I got on my hand, I think. The Buccaneers are only really discussed as an offshoot or a prologue to their more famous successors. In reality, the pirates of the early 18th century were the offshoot. They were the offshoot. And their period were the epilogue of the Buccaneer Age. Most of my channel is, in truth, about the Buccaneers. It shouldn't be called a pirate channel as much as it should be called a Buccaneer channel. Most of the pop history books and videos you'll find in the Buccaneers will give you an easily digested explanation of what they were, a comprehensive narrative. The Buccaneers were pirates and privateers. They began at a certain date, arbitrarily placed in 1630, 50, 60, somewhere around there, and often ending at 97. No such attempt to simplify the Buccaneers will be made in this video, in favor of the nuance and contextualization necessary to fully understand them, and their place in wider history. Dates are both a blessing and a curse. A linear time frame allows us to track history, but it also limits us in giving historical events a start and an end, which never existed. History is a continuum. The Buccaneers did not begin at any given date, nor end at any. Their existence was determined tens, possibly hundreds of years before their inception. Perhaps even upon the inception of man, when Eve first ate of the apple. Or when Cain picked up that sharp and murderous rock. The Buccaneers were pirates, they were privateers, they were sailors, and they were land crabs, soldiers, mercenaries, warriors, slaves and gentlemen, religious extremists, comparable both to the Crusaders and Daesh. They were empire builders and destroyers of empires. They were contradictions and agreements, and the grey zone in between, and they were as much real as they were unreal. In truth, we know very little about them. Colonial documents are scarce, ambiguous, and tainted by the impartial hand. Whether the Buccaneers were heroes or villains was determined by the whims of the public opinion just in that moment. There was no universal truth, and the reality of their deeds could be twisted by media publications, as much fiction and allegory as it was real. It is part of the reason why pirate history is stained and somewhat of a niche. Few people take it seriously, and few people hold it in high regard, because oftentimes it is just a bunch of barefoot guys in shirts and pants shooting at a couple of other guys. There are no armies of millions taken to the field, no grand architects raising monuments to last the ages. Pirate history is small and in the grand scheme of things, only ever involved a handful of individuals. We must apply scale. The piratical conflicts occurred in regions with low populations, making them large and impactful in relation to their surroundings. For most of the 17th century, the Buccaneers essentially held the thrapple of Spanish America in their constrictive grip, the homes of some millions of souls. However, Spain did not rely on their colonies for its population. Well, they just needed enough hands to harvest the silver needed to fund their global ambitions. Indeed, like so many conflicts, the piratical conflicts were chiefly fought over resources. In this case, luxury resources, sold at a high price back in Europe, the funds used for bigger ambitions. Now, luxury resources are luxury purely out of supply. Sugar isn't especially expensive nowadays, because we can grow beets and extract the sweet stuff from them. But back in the day, it basically came from just a handful of Brazilian and Caribbean plantations. The supply was lower, and the price much, much higher. So too was the case for dyestuffs, chocolate, ginger, spices. Just think about saffron nowadays. It can only be grown in a few handful of places, and is worth its weight in gold. The luxury goods were few in number, just like the men involved. Few people were needed to collect them, few people were needed to ship them, and few people were needed to steal them. Yet, the money they brought in could sustain empires. Like I've said in previous episodes, Napoleon was willing to sell all of French Louisiana to the United States, but he risked life and limb to recover the sugar colony of Saint-Domingue, which was only the coast of a relatively small island. So the Caribbean is an exceptional region in that such a small number of men could have such an impact on overall history and the course of empires. It's not like the kings and queens could just send over an army of soldiers and colonists to seize entire regions. They tried, and time and again, it ended up in failure and mass death by disease. As Henry Whistler said of Cromwell's expedition to Hispaniola. And now their hearts' war got out of their doublets into their breeches, and was nothing but shedding. Straight up fire from Mr. Whistler. While the small scale of this history makes it less appealing to those who prefer conflicts of a larger scale, I have always been drawn to episodes such as these, since the smaller numbers make it more intimate. The largest pirate army assembled by Henry Morgan, greatest of the Buccaneers, did not number above 2,000, and a typical Buccaneer company seldom more than 200. Unlike a great general or admiral, Buccaneer commanders would have been at least familiar with most of his men, intimately so with a great many. It is said that a human cannot have more than 100 close acquaintances, and that large numbers in general become difficult for us to comprehend. The smaller scale of the Caribbean conflicts therefore become more intimate, personal, and human. Casualties are not reduced to numbers, but the losses of actual persons. This in turn makes the region a vehicle prime for storytelling. I've already touched on the role of luxury goods in understanding the Buccaneers, and whilst this video won't purely be a cynical materialist analysis of history, economics do play a fundamental part in it. And economic factors were ultimately the one big cause behind the Buccaneer phenomenon. For those who are mistrustful of materialist analysis, I think it is necessary to say here that economics is very much part of the human condition, if one is to have it simplified as resource management. Of course, there is a natural logic to economics, and I believe that evolution has given us an innate understanding of scarcity at least, that surely must be shared with animals to a certain degree, which is probably what contributed to the rise of the first economic systems, even if so much of economics is artificial and disconnected from any natural scarcity. So to discuss economics is to discuss humanity, which is my life's ambition, aside from getting shit-faced drunk and otherwise indulging in, rampant debauchery. Whilst the reason for the Buccaneer phenomenon can surely be traced back many hundreds of years, convenience demands that we draw the line somewhere, and I will put it at the literal drawing of a line, that is, the line of demarcation. You probably have no idea of what I'm speaking of, and To be honest, I don't either half the time. Christopher Columbus discovered a new world in 1492 and returned home to Castile with this excellent news the next year. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed between Spain and Portugal, after Pope Alexander VI, himself a Spaniard, drew up an imaginary line 370 leagues west of the Azores, saying that everything to the east belonged to Portugal and anything discovered in the west was property of Spain. Spain in the 16th century had just exited several centuries of religious war, the Reconquista, which had hardened the Castilians, people from central Spain, into a warrior culture. Nobility was central to their mindset, as was the purity of blood, free from Jewish or Moorish admixture. Those who weren't born noble would achieve the rank by conquest. It was a land of pretentious conquerors and religious narcissists, and they declared that the New World belonged to them and them alone. Initially, even other Spaniards were forbidden from entering, and the Portuguese couldn't do so until the late 16th century. Unlike the Portuguese and Aragonese, the Castilians were never great at the whole trade business, and in truth, they kinda just stumbled into the conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires. These conquests were private enterprises, inspired by medieval Reconquista campaigns, in which the parties involved were mostly interested in acquiring personal wealth and land rather than setting up prosperous trade. The wealth of Mexico and Peru was largely dependent on the native civilizations, which were the most advanced in the Americas. Spain didn't believe so much in trade with the colonies as the extraction of raw resources, gold and silver especially. The flotas, also known as the treasure fleet or galleons, was an annual convoy system between Sevilla and various American ports, exchanging European goods for the New World harvests. Precious metals, jewels, pearls, dyestuffs, chocolate, spices, medicinal plants, and so on. The flota system had been implemented to counter smuggling and piracy, which had already become a problem before the conquest of Mexico had been finished. Part of the Aztec loot sent back to Spain was taken by a French corsair, Jon Sayles, as early as 1523. Any foreigner in the Americas was to be treated as a pirate. In 1556, a royal law was passed permitting colonial governors to execute any stranger possessing New World merchandise, and in 1573, the laws of the Kingdom of the Indies referred to them as corsarios y piratas. The Spanish did not acknowledge that these piratas might have a legal commission from a nation they were at war with, nor did they differentiate between pirates and simple merchants. 16th century corsairs were as much traders as they were pirates, because so often they found it easier to just trade with the colonial Spanish than get into a fight with them. The smugglers were starving for exotic luxury goods, and the colonials were dependent on European goods in return. Initially, they needed food, but as they increasingly built up the capacity to produce their own in the late 16th century, they began to demand tools, clothing, alcohol, or cutlery. Spain had neglected its industrial development and was unable to satisfy the demand. Nor was the domestic food production able to keep up. Iberia suffered from bouts of starvation and pandemic, and smugglers soon flocked to the colonies, carrying boatloads of grain, wine, and oil. Another crucial import was slaves. Pandemic and depression caused an unfathomable shrinkage of the native population, causing a severe labor shortage in the mines and gold fields. Africans had been enslaved in Iberia since the Middle Ages. They had been part of the exploration and conquistador expeditions, so using them as a cheap supplement came almost naturally. But according to Tordesillas, Africa belonged to Portugal, meaning that Spain couldn't buy their own slaves there. Special permits were granted to the Portuguese and Italians to sell slaves in the colonies, but it wasn't nearly enough, and the rest had to be supplied by northern smugglers. So much so that the practice was tacitly tolerated. Still, smuggling posed a serious threat to the Spanish, as it reduced the available amount of goods, including silver and gold, brought aboard the galleons. Severe measures were therefore taken to deal with the smugglers. In 1604, captured smugglers from England had their hands, feet, noses, and ears cut off, were smeared with honey, and then tied to trees to be tortured by insects. unfortunate. Smuggling was therefore risky, and it should come as no surprise that a growing hatred of the Spanish would make many prefer to just take the coveted riches by force. This was sort of recognized in the period, as noted by Sloan, a handful of years after the main age of buccaneering. The Spaniards are very barbarous to all nations in these parts, where they are superior. They think they have the only right to the West Indies, and it was a long time ere they could hear of any treaty with European nations. This was the first rise of the privateers, buccaneers or freebooters, who consisted of all nations except Spaniards, from whom they often took great riches, and as easily parted with them, to the people of their own nations. The hatred of the Spanish was motivated both by their pretentious restrictions, their cruelty, and their religious intolerance, all of which will be discussed in this segment. When the Spanish learned of Columbus's discovery, they believed that they had found an alternate route to Asia, hence why the Caribbean was called the Indies. They thought they had found India. Not only did this open up new opportunities for colonization and trade with mythical Cathay, but it would also open up a new front to attack the great enemy of Christendom, the Turk. Indeed, Portuguese and Spanish exploration was largely motivated by religion, both to find ways to counter Islam and conversion of the heathen. This set the religious tone that would dominate New World politics for the next 2 centuries. The Treaty of Tordesillas, organized by the Pope, was as religious as it was political and economic. It was only the Pope who had the authority to Christianize heathen lands, and by granting Spain the control of the New World, he gave them the power, right, and obligation to convert the native pagans to the true religion. The New World was to be Catholic, and the Protestant heretics of France, England, and the Netherlands had no place in it. Of course, the sentiment wasn't one-sided. The Protestants had as many zealots as the Catholics, eager to shoot down saintly statues, desecrate churches, and tear down the Pope's dominion. Calvinist dissent in the Spanish Netherlands led to the Dutch Revolt in the 1560s, which would last until the mid-17th century. Supported by the English and French heretics, the war against Spain was a war at sea, and usually fought by pirates. In the early 17th century, a few especially religious Englishmen believed that the Anglican Church hadn't gone far enough from its Catholic roots, and they wanted to cleanse it, make it pure. Hence they were called Puritans, and they were some of the biggest sponsors of anti-Spanish piracy. Pirate ships sailed out of their early colonies of Virginia and New England. The Puritan Providence Company erected colonies on Tortuga and Santa Catalina for the express purpose of attacking Spain's possessions. In the 1640s, the Puritans seized control of England, shortened the king, and established a dictatorship led by Oliver Cromwell. Not long after, a massive expedition was sent to conquer the Spanish Americas. If one needs any further evidence that colonial policy and buccaneering was motivated by trade and religion, look no further than Cromwell's demands to the Spanish ambassador: religious tolerance and trade rights. The ambassador refused, just as Cromwell had hoped, and the invasion set sail. Cromwell was largely motivated by a New England clergyman, John Cotton, regarded as a leading interpreter of biblical prophecies. Cotton believed that taking from the Spaniards would dry up the river Euphrates, thus fulfilling the prophecy of Revelation 16:12, which heralded the end times. Basically, Puritan colonial policy was fueled by a theory of apocalyptic accelerationism. Welcome to Deep Pirate Lore. As aforementioned, the Spaniards did not merely discriminate based on religion, but ethnicity. In 1565, a nascent colony in Florida was massacred by the Spanish, with 300 French heretics massacred. 16 Catholics were spared and deported. It wasn't especially difficult to hate the Spanish. Fueled by their American silver, monarchs like Felipe II and statesmen like Olivares sent Spain on multiple campaigns of aggression in Europe, seeking to expand their territory and political dominance. Most nations in Europe saw them as an aggressor seeking world domination, which they openly did. It wasn't difficult to hate the Spanish, and it was further fueled by reports of their immense cruelty. This was further exacerbated by the rise of the printing press, allowing the mass translation and publishing of reports of Spanish cruelty. In the 1640s and 50s, shortly before the buccaneering peak, hatred of the Spaniard was driven up by the publishing of Thomas Gage's The English American, a travel account across Spanish America, and translations of the works of Bartolomé de las Casas and Tomás Campanella. These books describe the cruelties committed by Spaniards, primarily upon the native inhabitants of the New World. These works, along with earlier reports and various rumors, all contributed to the construction of a mythos nowadays called the Black Legend. Essentially, it was a propaganda campaign to demonize Spain, and so justified piracy and conquest as a way to avenge or aid the persecuted Indians. The Black Legend was rooted in truth. The conquistadors had committed immense cruelties upon the native populace, but what Spain's enemies failed to admit is that the reason these crimes were published by Las Casas, Campanella, and others was explicitly to highlight this cruelty as to provoke a change of policy in Spain. Even when Columbus returned from his first expedition with a handful of native slaves, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand were repulsed and demanded the slaves be freed. The clergy were abhorred by the conquistadors' treatment of the natives, who they saw as children. Intelligent children, sure, that could grow into proper adults once they had been converted. 16th century Spanish monarchs were surprisingly humane, with Charles V declaring that all Native Americans were his subjects and under his protection. Enslavement of them was outlawed, unless if they had committed some horrendous crime. Of course, this didn't mean that the natives weren't subjugated and, on occasion, maltreated, but the Black Legend focused on the overwhelmingly bad and not the good. I'm in no way trying to justify Spanish atrocities, merely to highlight the fallacies and, now, the hypocrisy of those who condemn them. The Spanish were in no way unique in how they treated their enemies. All nations tortured, persecuted, plundered, and massacred. Ask the Dutchmen what they did to the natives of the Spice Islands. Ask the English what happened to the native Carib on St. Christopher. The French were actually kind of nice to the Indians, but don't ask them what happened on St. Bartholomew's Day, the Siege of La Rochelle, or the Dragonades. And as we'll see later on in the video, once the French and English had consolidated their Caribbean possessions, they too would implement the same trade restrictions as the Spanish had done, completely ignoring the historical evidence to its awful consequences. But more on that later. The artificial line which Spain had drawn up would be the namesake of the policy that determined colonial affairs. No peace beyond the line. It meant that the political state in Europe had no impact on colonial politics. If the home nations were at peace, the colonies would be at war. When the English conquered Jamaica in 1655, the local governor protested by saying that the island was Spanish, by papal authority and 140 years of occupation. The English commander responded bluntly, "Law does not give possession, only force of arms." No peace beyond the line was quite literate. The roiling Caribbean Sea ran crimson red. Now that we have established the reasons for going after the Spanish, we must take a look at the situation itself, the state of the colonies and the Caribbean, and what allowed the Buccaneers to spring up and flourish in its circumstance. In spite of its flaunting, Spain in the 17th century was weak. Spain's imperial age is known as the Golden Century, but for the common man, it was far from it. During this period appeared a certain type of literature called the picaresque. These concern an archetypal character, the picaro, a rogue who is willing to risk his own honor if he can improve his status in society, even if it means marrying a widow or becoming the servant to a priest. Improving his status often just meant getting 3 or just 1 square meal a day, and hunger is a recurring theme in these pieces, because hunger was a recurring theme in 17th century Spain. As aforementioned, food production had lagged behind, grain had to be imported, and starvation became a serious problem on the peninsula. Lack of nutrition made the common man susceptible to disease, and pandemics claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands.
The 16th century population of 8 million shrunk to 6 in the 17th. That is besides the numerous conflicts Spain was embroiled in during the early 17th century. The Dutch War of Independence, intermittent wars with France and England, the 30 Years' War, and then the Portuguese War of Independence and Catalan Revolt, bringing the spectre of violence to the peninsula itself. The mighty tercios, once thought invincible, were bested at Rocroi, and Spain had lost its military edge. Its fleet of galleons were increasingly turning obsolete, with the best sailors and shipbuilders of the empire being the Flemish corsairs of Dunkirk. 17th century Spain was overextended, overambitious, weak, and surrounded. It was isolated from its colonies. Messages to and fro could take as long as 8 months, and the treasure fleet went from annual to biannual to triannual. Whilst the colonies didn't have the same problem of starvation as the homeland, and craft guilds were beginning to flourish, the native population had shrunk dramatically and struggled to recover. The local governments were corrupt, defenses often consisted of outdated castles and poorly armed militias. On occasion, Spain sent over a pirate hunting fleet, usually consisting of ships far too cumbersome to act efficiently in the treacherous Caribbean, and much too slow to pursue the rapid pirate ships. This is what made the New World susceptible to pirates and smugglers. Now, in the 16th and early 17th century, pirates were mostly gentlemen captains, sponsored by other gentlemen, often the government itself, that owned a ship and hired a crew of sailors who couldn't differentiate between naval action, piracy, and trade. The Royal Navy and Dutch Navy both had their beginnings in their respective corsairing groups, the Sea Dogs and Waterhose. They were a far cry from the Buccaneers, a chaotic and independent lot, who had their roots in the various entrepreneurs and pioneers that would come to settle the Caribbean. In the 1620s, the English, French, and Dutch began to build colonies on a few tiny Caribbean islands. Life as an early Caribbean pioneer was, to put it bluntly, crap. Hard work and hot weather, all of which the pioneers were unadapted to. They didn't trust the local food, they didn't know where best to live, how to dress, and though likely to die from a Carib arrow, it was likelier to pass away from some horrific disease like malaria or dysentery. Those who settled in the Caribbean were all a little bit crazy, many of them forced. Criminals, prisoners of war, dregs picked off the street, deported to do some good or die. Everyone had a bit of a pirate mentality, and many colonies were established by flat-out pirates, or had their settlers and governors partake in piracy themselves. To these people, the goal wasn't to build a permanent society, a heaven on earth. It was to get rich quick, either by planting some tobacco and selling it, or stealing gold from the Spanish. The first Buccaneers were a unique brand of pioneers. In the 16th century, corsairs and smugglers primarily traded with the island of Hispaniola, which likewise housed a number of suitable coves and islands, where they could supply and recuperate. Some of the corsairs took a special liking to the island, and stayed there for indefinite amounts of time, hunting local game with which to supply passing ships with provisions or hides. Spain made various provisions against the Hispaniola smuggling, mostly sending out galleys to catch the culprits. In 1605, after Protestant Bibles were found among the locals, most definitely spread by the smugglers, a royal proclamation ordered the depopulation of the west and north coast. The denizens forcefully migrated to the southeast. Few were happy with the decision, and some of them rebelled, creating small communities that continued to interact with the interlopers. Most significant was the failure to move the vast herds of farm animals. Out of 110,000 heads of cattle, only 8,000 were rounded up, 2,000 of which actually survived. The rest of the cattle, along with countless pigs, horses, goats, and donkeys, escaped into the wilds and became feral. They were just waiting to be shot, skinned, cooked, and devoured. The first Buccaneers were marooned sailors, adventurers, escaped slaves, and other scalawags that out of passion or desperation settled as hunters on the abandoned coast of Hispaniola. The meat of their slain quarries was cut into long, thin strips, and smoked over a wooden grill of indigenous origin. Some call it Arawak, but by 1605, the Arawak had been driven to extinction on Hispaniola. I find it unlikely that the Buccaneers learned this technique from them. It is likelier that they picked it up from the Spanish, who had definitely learned it from the Arawak. Similar techniques have survived in the Caribbean and Mexican barbacoa, or from other native groups like the Carib. I've even theorized in a previous video that the French might have picked it up in 16th century Brazil. Anyway, the French called the grill boucan, and its users Buccaneer, which was then anglicized into Buccaneer.
So at first, Buccaneer referred to a group of hunters, but somehow it came to mean pirate, privateer, mercenary, thingam-poopy-majig? This warrants a discussion of nomenclature. These include the words boucanier, buccaneer, and filibuster.
Buccaneer, as Faure said, is a French word, and was used throughout the 17th century to refer exclusively to the rogue hunters on Hispaniola. These hunters soon became partners to various sea rovers, both pirates and privateers, who began to use the coast as a base. The line between pirate and privateer was ambiguous during the entire period. A privateer had a commission from a government, permitting them to attack an enemy nation, usually at war, but sometimes in peace, if the antagonist nation had caused some reprieve. Most pirates of the Age of Sail claimed to be privateers, often for flimsy reasons, and buccaneers used any document they could find to prove their legality, especially once the laws got stricter in the late 17th century. These included commissions from foreign governments, or even just commissions to cut wood, hunt, and fish. Sometimes they claimed to be privateers of indigenous nations. Spain basically treated all privateers, merchants, and smugglers as pirates, and since everyone hated the Spanish, there wasn't really a point in making a fuss about the actual legality. Attacking Spain was cool. Because of their interaction with the hunters, these sea rovers would become known in English as buccaneers. It is unknown how exactly and when buccaneer in English came to mean the rovers and not the hunters, but it must have been very early, at least in the 1640s or 50s. Hispaniola pioneers often switched between hunting and pirating, so to the English, the term buccaneer must have been fluid enough to be used for both professions. In French, it is a bit more simple. The hunters were called boucanier, and the pirates were called flibustier, or filibuster in English. The etymology of flibustier is of some interest and dispute. One theory alleges that it stems from a type of vessel called flibon. This was a smaller and speedier version of the Dutch float, and very popular with 17th century sea rovers. The idea is that the filibusters were named after their favorite type of ship. A more simple explanation is that it just derives from the Dutch vrijbuiter, freebooter in English. Who knows? Now, historians dispute whether there was a difference between buccaneers and filibusters. The usual explanation is that the buccaneers were English and the filibusters were French. However, I have personally never observed any significant difference in how they operated. To the contrary, and using the terms to draw a national line is arbitrary when the buccaneers were multinational. Among the ranks were English and Frenchmen, yes, but also Dutchmen, Native Americans, Africans, Flemings, Scandinavians, Italians, Portuguese, Livonians, and Spaniards. The same captain, crewman, and company would serve under England, only to go over to the French, and then use a commission from rebellious Portugal. So in the end, I don't think there was a significant difference between the buccaneers and filibusters. What you called them was just up to the language you spoke. To the English, buccaneer. To the French, flibustier. To the Dutch, zeerovers. To the Spanish, piratas. Many historians explain the buccaneer rampage against the Spanish as originating in them going after the buccaneers' hunting grounds, squashing the buccaneer colony on Tortuga, killing the buccaneers' families there, and then trying to drive them away by killing off their game. It is true that the lack of game did drive many of the hunters into piracy. But it must be remembered that any colonial effort, hunting especially, was in itself regarded as piracy by the Spanish. They knew what they were doing, and the filibusters were active on Hispaniola and interacting with the hunters long before the Spaniards started going after the hunters. While this campaign surely did motivate many and gave cause for revenge, so too could any personal grievance, and it wasn't a cause for the buccaneering phenomenon. That was a general hatred of the Spanish, religious disputes, and desire for luxury goods. As the French and English began constructing their Caribbean colonies, a new need for the Buccaneers would arise: the need to defend and economically expand the burgeoning colonies. In 1629, the Franco-English colony on St. Kitts was eradicated by a Spanish force, which continued to the remaining islands of the Lesser Antilles. Tortuga was repeatedly occupied and ransacked. All in all, the early colonies were poor, lowly populated, and susceptible to attack. By providing the Buccaneers a safe haven and pretenses of legality, the colonies were given a semi-standing garrison of well-armed, experienced fighters. Their expeditions served as preemptive strikes and intelligence-gathering operations, informing the governors of Spanish plans before they could act, not to mention the collection of loot. Buccaneers spent their money in the taverns, brothels, and shops of the port, stimulating the economy, and allowing the governors to construct plantations, infrastructure, and defenses. Goods bought cheaply from the Buccaneers were sold at a higher price, often back to the Spanish. Most valuable were the slaves taken, which were used as a cheap labor force. When the Buccaneers were done, they were warmly invited to buy land and build estates, or settle down as hunters or logwood cutters, contributing to the economy and defense both. Buccaneering became an unofficially official component of early Caribbean empire building. In the end, this is truly what makes them different from other piratical groups in history. To take a respite from the heavy discussion, we can talk turkey on who the Buccaneers actually were. The private individuals that made up their ranks, where they came from, and what they looked like. Naturally, the Buccaneers consisted of people of many diverse backgrounds, with many undoubtedly being regular sailors, deserters from merchantmen, old pirates, adventurers, motivated by greed, religion, a hatred of Spain, or some personal vendetta. They aren't especially distinct, and do not warrant further discussion. Next we have the namesake of the English Buccaneers, the Buccaneers, those intrepid hunters on the island of Hispaniola. Even though they were relatively few in number, perhaps between 500 to 1,000 at their peak, they left a significant impact on the Buccaneers. Aside from their name, their way of curing meat would be the chief method of provisioning buccaneering expeditions. Most significant may have been their tactics and marksmanship. The Buccaneers were excellent jungle fighters, light skirmishers, running through the woods and picking off targets with remarkable accuracy. Their long flintlock musket, the Buccaneer gun, earned a reputation for extraordinary accuracy, making it a favorite weapon of the Buccaneers, before spreading to naval and merchant service. Regular pirates would use it well into the late 18th century, when other factions considered it obsolete, and we can see it on a print of Marooner Captain Stede Bonnet. A significant number of the hunters and buccaneers both were made up of escaped slaves and freemen of color. Escaping their appalling conditions, they found a more tolerable life in the wilderness, where the buccaneers were so desperate for men as to accept anyone that could pick up a gun. Many of the slaves likewise had information about their former masters, and served as guides, eyes and ears to their newfound companions. That said, the Buccaneers must not be held up as champions of racial equality. Many of them who left behind journals, like John Cox or William Dampier, expressed racist sentiment towards Africans, colored Spaniards, or mixed-raced folk. The Buccaneers partook heavily in the slave trade, raiding ships and colonies for slaves, and keeping many of them for their own use. If a Buccaneer was wounded, their laws decreed that he could get a sum of money, or a score of slaves. Slaves were used to perform menial labor and carry baggage during marches. That said, some of these slaves were liberated by their masters, and might stay in the company as free fighters. These confusing racial dynamics often resulted in buccaneer crews consisting both of free and enslaved men of color, some of them owning slaves themselves. Not only were there African slaves, but Native Americans, enslaved both by the Spanish and the other nations. Free Native Americans would also join Buccaneer crews, as their tribes would often trade or ally with the Buccaneers against the Spanish. In 1662, a nephew of Oliver Cromwell, Sir Thomas Whetstone, commanded a Buccaneer crew of 60, most of them Indians of an unknown tribe. Natives were especially valued for their skills in striking, spearfishing turtle and manatee, to provision the Buccaneer ship. Endangered animals. Yummy. Similar to slaves were indentured servants. These were white Europeans placed under a contract to serve a colonial master for a set or indefinite amount of time. You could be indentured as punishment for committing a crime, for simply being a beggar or vagabond stumbling down the street, or for opposing the government. During the various British civil wars, rebels, especially the Scots and Irish, were indentured and deported into colonial service. But you could also indenture yourself if you had few other options and needed passage to the colonies.
From now on, you will stand out in life as an individual. Will I? Well, of course you will. All the other slaves will be black.
The conditions of indentured servants were appalling, with countless documents testifying to how they were treated worse than the actual slaves. This was because the servants were on a timed contract with an expiration date. It was best to expend them before the contract ended. Meanwhile, slaves were to be kept indefinitely and had been bought for a good sum of money. Though slaves were initially and often used recklessly, masters soon realized that it was better to treat them at least somewhat decently. Meanwhile, servants were ruthlessly beaten and worked to death, often given assignments such as draining wetlands, where you were especially susceptible to disease. This made the servants less inclined to stay with their masters. When St. Kitts was attacked by Spain in 1629, the Irish servants deserted over to their fellow Catholics. Indentured servants were recruited for Cromwell's American expedition, and the Buccaneers would continue the practice. If the servant stayed in service until the end of his contract, he was more likely to join the Buccaneers than to become a hard-working colonist. Why drudge away in a field, even on land owned by yourself, when you could pick up a musket, shoot a few Spaniards, and make a fortune? Many of them didn't have a choice. Slaves were brought in to replace them. The core of Buccaneer tactics came from Native Americans, the hunters, and veteran soldiers who joined them en masse in the 50s and 60s. Cromwell's expedition, the Western design, was a near-total failure. Hispaniola remained Spanish, while the English claimed underdeveloped Jamaica. The soldiers who survived were more keen on joining buccaneering expeditions than sitting around and garrisoning a fort. Even in the 1680s, we find old soldiers among the Buccaneers, with William Dampier writing the following. He was a stout old grey-headed man, aged about 84, who had served under Oliver in the time of the Irish Rebellion, after which he was at Jamaica and had followed privateering ever since. Thus, we find an unbroken line between the new model army and multiple generations of buccaneers. This will be further discussed in a bit. Aside from the scum of the earth flocking beneath the buccaneers' red banners, so too were they joined by the respectable sort. Aristocrats and gentlemen, sometimes assuming command of the scoundrels with their ships and commissions, others down on their luck, standing in file with musket and cutlass. So too were there men with a payable skill. Dampier noting sawyers, carpenters, joiners, brickmakers, bricklayers, shoemakers, tailors, etc. Dampier himself was an educated fellow, and indeed, the Buccaneers hosted a remarkable number of scholars. He himself compiled the journals of his travels into several books, primarily detailing geography, navigation, flora and fauna, native cultures, and so on. Scholarly companions of his include Lionel Wafer, Basil Ringrose, with even their captain, Bartholomew Sharp, having a go at publishing. Alexander Exquemelin, a surgeon, sailed with Henry Morgan, and later published his adventure. Among the French we have Ravenel de Lausson, not to mention the various priests like Thomas Gage or Jean-Baptiste Labat. Not only have all of these men been instrumental in giving us a vivid understanding of the Buccaneers, but they were impactful in their own time in shaping the perception of themselves. Again, it will be discussed in a bit. We have a good idea of what the Buccaneers looked like, owing to a trove of eyewitness descriptions, passing mentions, and even illustrations. Soldiers and colonists of the Caribbean were often given clothing completely unsuitable for the climate. Woolen caps, thick coats, and these were often damned by the clever sort and the Buccaneers. Settlers were seldom dressed in little more than a shirt and breeches, and Requiem writes of the Buccaneers that the greatest part of them having no other clothes than a pair of seaman's trousers or breeches, and a shirt without shoes or stockings. Many are the documents describing the Buccaneers as going barefoot, even cutting their own feet from marching in thick jungle, owing to the lack of shoes. They did have a preference for sailcloth jackets, often dyed blue. These were documented during the sack of Veracruz, with the Buccaneers armed with their iconic flintlock muskets. Blue jackets were nothing unique to them, but common among sailors overall. Hans Sloan documented how a sailor found his blue jacket inside the stomach of a shark. Most notable, Buccaneers were armed for war. As seen on this eyewitness image, they had 2 pistols, a cutlass, a musket, and 1 or 2 cartridge boxes. As for headwear, a broad-brimmed hat of some kind seems to have been defavored, often folded on 1 or 2 sides. They also had a liking for peaked headwear, common in the European armed forces of the time. These include the Montero cap or carapace, similar to a modern military cap. The hunters would even make their own version, taking a regular hat and cropping the sides, leaving only a frontal visor. These might have been called cropped hats, and appear to have been popular with the regular Buccaneers also. Overall, the broad brim dominated. The various buccaneers, hunters, and tobacco planters on Hispaniola's western coast, Saint-Domingue, gathered together to form the Brethren of the Coast, a loose confederation that shared no leader, but various cultural tendencies, traditions, and customs. This included their independent streak and anarchic nature. Every buccaneer saw himself as a lord and could tolerate no other man leading him. No man was bound to his vessel and was free to leave whenever he wanted. Their leaders and officers were elected by the men, and if they somehow proved disappointing, they would be deposed. The first Buccaneer expedition to the Pacific saw the company split up and depose its commanders on multiple occasions, mostly on charges of cowardice. The expedition was rife with political disputes, backstabbing, and intrigue, which is contradicted by other accounts of Buccaneers parting amicably, resolving their issues peacefully, and generally being friendly and generous towards each other, contradicted again by stories of captains arguing and dueling over private squabbles. Outsiders viewed the Buccaneers as lazy shits and scum of the earth, especially as general sentiment shifted against them in the late 17th century, when they became more of a problem. The authorities agreed on their self-will, caprice, and dislike of work. When offered bits of land on Jamaica and the possibility to retire, many refused, knowing the hard work that awaited them. Lebet attributed their preference for small, simple-rigged vessels like barks and sloops to a dislike of work in the first place. They needed minimum seamanship, and indeed, since so many of the Buccaneers were former servants, slaves, and soldiers, they lacked skills in sailing, and ripe are the incidents of them running into foolish accidents. Much of Morgan's fleet was shipwrecked during the Panama expedition. In return, the Buccaneers looked down upon common sailors. According to the Baron de Pointy, they viewed sailors on sail ships as white niggers, no better than slaves. Pointy found the Buccaneers to be very bad subjects, who believe they have not been put in the world except to practice brigandage and piracy. Enemies of subordination and authority, their example ruins the colonies, all the young people having no other wish than to embrace this profession for its libertinage and ability to gain booty. The Buccaneers weren't anti-monarchy as a rule. The king was seen as a sort of semi-sacred figure by people in the 17th century, and when the Saint-Domingue filibusters revolted against the control of the French West India Company in the 1660s, they declared that only the King of France had jurisdiction over them. On the 25th of August, 1685, filibusters celebrated the festival of St. Louis by lighting a huge bonfire in honor of the king, burning 200,000 pesos worth of logwood, a precious dye. Those anti-monarchists among the Buccaneers would certainly have been various English radicals, spawned before and during the Civil War. Not only did it include Cromwellian extremists, but various semi-religious, semi-political groups that have posthumously been called proto-socialist. Rejecting the state church, they held further ideas of democracy and collective ownership. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, many of these radicals moved to the Caribbean. A radical sect called the Fifth Monarchists was active in smuggling. On Barbados was seen a ranter, a sect derived from the Gnostic tradition, believing that heaven and hell were simply states of mind. Many of these individuals likely found a home among the anarchy of the Buccaneers. The buccaneering period lasted roughly between 1630 and 1690, and can be divided into three somewhat distinct periods. The early period, 1630 to 1655, the high period, 1655 to 1671, and the late period, 1671 to 1690. During these periods, the circumstances changed, the behavior of the Buccaneers evolved as they adapted to the changes in politics and how they were viewed. In the early period, the Caribbean colonies were slowly being established. The Brethren had gotten a foothold on the west coast of Hispaniola, Saint-Domingue, and established a colony on the island of Tortuga. This would be their main base until the next period. From here they launched expeditions into the Spanish Main, primarily going after ships and small towns, but attacking big cities on occasion. The next period starts in 1655 with the English conquest of Jamaica. Shortly after, expedition ships were sent out to pirate against the Spanish, and the military governor invited 250 of the buccaneers. It was during this period that buccaneering reached its height, under leaders like Christopher Minks, Francois L'Olonnais, and Henry Morgan, all of whom ransacked entire cities, defeated armies, and commanded hundreds of men and fleets of ships. Buccaneers worked closely with colonial governors like Thomas Modiford of Jamaica and Bertrand d'Orgeron of Saint-Domingue, who sought to use the buccaneers for economic and defensive purposes, while expanding the sugar industries of their burgeoning islands. Both the French and English sponsored attacks against the Spanish. The period ended in 1670, when England made peace with Spain, and Jamaica made a slow shift towards trading with the Spanish instead of attacking them. Nonetheless, Jamaica would continue to tacitly support buccaneers, even if a handful were hanged as pirates. Therefore, most of them preferred Saint-Domingue, which continued its dependence and support of filibusters until the late 17th or early 18th century. Around 1690, the French and English became enemies. The buccaneers started fighting each other as national privateers, or they abandoned the Caribbean and sailed to the Indian Ocean to rob from the Mughal Empire. These were the three main eras of buccaneering summarized, and it will be discussed in nuance again in a bit. So, what was the impact the buccaneers had? From 1655 to 1671, buccaneers sacked 18 cities, 4 towns, and more than 35 villages. Several places were attacked multiple times. Cumanagote, Maracaibo, and Gibraltar twice, Rio de la Hacha 5 times, Tolu 8 times, and other places on Cuba and Hispaniola innumerable times. In 1685, the Marqués de Barinas estimated the Spanish losses in 1660 to be 60 million ducats, which barely covered the destruction of towns, treasure, and more than 250 naval and merchant ships boarded and captured. All in all, the buccaneers were utterly devastating. So, what made the buccaneers so effective? Frequently outnumbered, how could such a small minority cause such an incredible devastation against a large, more well-populated empire? We have already talked about Spanish weakness in the 17th century. The pessimism of the natives, the growing discontent with the home country, their isolation and unmet demands had a significant impact on morale. Why fight against an enemy that isn't here to conquer you anyway, just to take your stuff? This problem was further exacerbated by the poor equipment and lacking defenses of the Spaniards, coupled with their troops being untrained and inexperienced. bar a select few of murderous elites. Most of the Spanish colonial defenses consisted of town militias, given a spear and shield, archaic firearm if he was lucky, and perhaps given a coca leaf to chew on. The Buccaneers had the advantage in equipment, tactics, and morale. Instead of being armed with the unhandy matchlock musket, they privately purchased state-of-the-art flintlocks, a favorite weapon of colonists owing to its suitability in the rugged terrain. The matchlock was a weapon for European pike and shot, the flintlock for guerrilla skirmishers and line warfare. The Buccaneer tactics came from their corps of hunters, veteran soldiers, and native warriors. The soldiers instilled rigid discipline and training. The Buccaneers were often documented as fighting in organized lines, or special formations for countering cavalry. Some have noted a resemblance of the Buccaneers to mercenary forces that fought in Europe during the early 17th century, in conflicts like the British Civil Wars and 30 Years' War. The Buccaneers marched in rank, used a vanguard called the Forlorn Hope, adopted war names or nicknames instead of civil names, extracted tribute from occupied settlements, and had a tradition of autonomy and elected leaders. It is not unlikely that many of their foundational members had been part of these mercenary forces. Scots, French, and Englishmen all fought in the 30 Years' War, including the two uncles of Henry Morgan himself. As for their morale, most Buccaneers were inspired by the principle of no purchase, no pay. They did not earn a regular salary. They could only get paid from what they caught. They had to fight, they had to win. That was the only way to get rich. Personal courage and initiative was rewarded. Captains were elected based on their experience, skill, or the sheer size of their cannonballs, and men who threw grenades over ramparts, climbed over walls, or were wounded were given extra compensation. Winning and fighting well paid off, literally. That is not to mention their personal hatred of the Spanish, driven by the Black Legend, and their religious zealotry. The Puritan influence on the Buccaneers must not be underestimated, nor the Cromwellian soldiers documented among them. Veterans of the New Model Army, they were instilled with the idea of a religious war against the Spanish, and Buccaneers were frequently documented as using saints as target practice, desecrating churches, executing priests, or using monks and nuns as meat shields. The French Catholics were tolerated because the French were seen as being more tolerant. Nor did the French spare their fellow Catholics, but stole the silver and artifacts from the churches and put them in their own. Religious disputes would naturally arise in the ranks of the Buccaneers, but it always seems to have been minor. It was initially believed that the Buccaneers would have a positive impact on the colonies they served, and the idea might still be so. And whilst they were surely crucial in conquering, settling, and defending French Saint-Domingue and defending English Jamaica, their excess would have a negative impact on the economies and demographics of the colonies. The promise of easy riches and 3 square meals a day, mostly meat, was enough to lure any colonist away from his farm, or make an indentured servant escape the plantation. Sir Thomas Lynch, governor of Jamaica, estimated that between 1668 and 1671, his island alone had lost 2,600 men on buccaneering raids, creating a significant labor shortage and retarding agricultural development. For a comparison, the capital of Jamaica, Port Royal, numbered only between 2,000 to 3,000, with Jamaica's total population in 1684 sitting at 15,000. At their height, between 1660 and 1680, the Buccaneers are estimated to have never exceeded a total of 3,000 men. So the recruitment caused a significant drain, especially from smaller islands like Barbados, St. Christopher's, and Nevis, who suffered a genuine depopulation of white inhabitants. One positive impact of Buccaneer recruitment was that it removed the criminal element. Offenses like murder and theft were relatively uncommon in the colonies. There will always be a breed of man, small or significant, depending on the times, that for whatever reason seek out the thrill of adventure, plunder, and violence. It is up to society as to how these men are treated. Even though I've said before that buccaneering was caused by economic policy, it is not entirely correct. There was always going to be that small number of men who would have turned to criminal deeds regardless. But since there was a demand for the restricted luxury goods, and violence was the only way in which to acquire them, buccaneering and violence was sponsored. They were given access to ports where they could spend their loot, sold arms and ammunition, and allowed to sell those precious luxuries. No government seemed to realize in time the snowball effect this would have, especially the French and English, when they ironically restricted their own colonies from trading with Dutch merchants. Unable to conduct peaceful commerce, their sailors were driven into buccaneering instead. And when the snowball had picked up pace, it was difficult to stop. Both France and England realized this a bit too late in the 1670s. As early as 1666, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lynch observed how naked orders to restrain the buccaneers, or call them in, will teach them only to keep out of this port and force them, it may be, to prey on us as well as the Spaniards. If Jamaica didn't support the buccaneers, they would get commissions from the French or Portuguese. Jamaica had supported the buccaneers as much because they needed them as they feared them. England made peace with Spain in 1670, with Jamaica and all other English islands recognized as English possessions. Proper forts were erected, garrisoned, and supplied with Royal Navy vessels. The colonies could now defend themselves without buccaneers. As for economic policy, Sir Thomas Lynch replaced the pro-buccaneer Thomas Modifer the same year, and began the shift from a buccaneer economy to a plantation one. He promised the settlers that peaceful commerce would not only be more honorable than buccaneering, but infinitely more profitable. Even though the Spanish officially declined, there was more than enough space for smugglers bringing in manufactured goods and slaves. Lynch himself was a factor in the Royal African Company, which held a monopoly on English slave trading. As the 17th century progressed, the Spanish colonies became so reliant on smuggling that tacit acceptance became unofficial policy. Now, the buccaneers at their height could probably have conquered one, two, or maybe even all of the Spanish-American colonies, but why should they? Spain had and was essentially doing all the hard work. They had built up the systems, infrastructure, and populations for extracting the wealth of the land. The other nations could just go in there, steal it. Well, now it seemed more profitable to trade for it. And by having these rogue elements coming in, taking the ships and burning the towns you wanted to trade with, and ruining the relations with your smuggling partners, the buccaneers were quickly becoming a problem. When Jamaica made its shift towards smuggling in the 1670s, the buccaneers were increasingly viewed through a negative lens. It wasn't even until 1677 that they could be executed for piracy on Jamaica. In no better man is the shift more well observed than Henry Morgan himself. Instituted as lieutenant governor of the island, Morgan began his career by pardoning buccaneers, making backdoor dealings with them, or directing them for service in Saint-Domingue, from whence he received a commission payment from their plunder. By 1681, repeatedly pressed by the home government and local planters, Morgan had turned into a buccaneer hater. This can best be observed when he sued the English publisher of the 1684 History of the Buccaneers for calling him a pirate. Morgan said he had been a privateer, not a pirate. And of the buccaneers, his lawyer said, "There are such thieves and pirates called buccaneers who subsist by piracy, depredations and evil deeds of all kinds without lawful authority, that of these people Henry Morgan always had and still has hatred." Was it a farce to save face? Maybe. Morgan certainly didn't hate the buccaneers 14 years ago. Either way, it shows how public opinion in England had shifted against the buccaneers. This came as a result both of the peace with Spain and shift in economic policy towards trade, but also an increasing media portrayal of buccaneers. During the early 17th century, reports and popular accounts of the buccaneers had been virtually non-existent, limited to a handful of government reports and eyewitness testimonies, which seldom painted as vivid a picture, nor presented a full reality of their atrocities. First came The Grand Pirate in 1675, an account of the career of a pirate, George Cusack. After decades of support for pirates and buccaneers, this text was the first in a while to portray them as antagonistic. Cusack attacked Englishmen and was even satanistic. He usurped courtly language in order to assume authority over his victims and establish himself as an independent lord of the sea. His crime was more so that he dared to stand up against the social order. How much of the Grand Pirate is accurate is hard to say. Most works of the period claiming to be true and accurate were usually dramatized in order to convey a message, and the Grand Pirate appears allegorical. Instead of viewing this as a hindrance, we should see it as an insight into the shifting mentality against pirates, and of society as a whole. No doubt, the Grand Pirate was influenced by the Restoration, the Enlightenment, and Hobbes' Leviathan, and concept of the social contract. I believe that these political movements and philosophical developments were crucial in the downfall of the Buccaneers. The Buccaneers were the relic of an old age. They were part of that ancient warrior tradition in which it was acceptable to earn your fortune by going out into the field and taking it by force. An age of religious strife, where the highest honor lay in going to sea and waging war against the enemy of your faith. But with the end of the 30 Years' War and the Puritan Commonwealth, the fiery religiosity that had plunged Europe into decades of bloodshed had burned out. Philosophers began to question the blind zealotry. While they did not deny God, mind you, they began to look to rationalism and empiricism as new methods of understanding the world. All lay not in the hands of providence. Man had the ability to change his surroundings. The idea of barefooted bearded boys by boat blasting Valencians by blundering boomsticks suddenly looked very old-fashioned. Rationalism gave way for new ideas on how to build the British Empire, and peaceful trade and commerce with the Spanish, again, looked preferable. So too did the religious dictatorship of Cromwell, religious anarchy and independent streak look irrational with the development of the social contract by Hobbes, in which humans band together for mutual need and protection and require a divinely ordained state to defend them from chaos. Buccaneers and pirates were that chaos, as represented by the fictionalized George Cusack, as he usurps the language of government to declare his own state, following under Satan instead of God. All of these political developments and philosophical ideas, deliberately or not, were part of that great wave which was the societal trend that can be observed in The Grand Pirate, the first book to shift the attitude against piracy. Next, in 1684, came the Buccaneers of America. Originally published in 1678 in Holland by the aforementioned Exquemelin, himself a buccaneer that had sailed under Morgan. This work was a striking critique of colonialism. According to Exquemelin, violent subjugation had been a component of empire building ever since the Spaniard. And in turn, English and French colonial governors used the buccaneers how the Spanish had used the conquistadors, to plunder, subjugate, and build the colonies of Jamaica and Saint-Domingue. Furthermore, Exquemelin made no restraints in describing the cruelties of the buccaneers. Spaniards cannibalized, children tortured, women ravished, old men burned alive, religious folk used as meat shields, and Morgan himself starving a woman for refusing to sleep with him. Again, Exquemelin's work was allegorical, striped by religiosity, and many of its incidents dramatized for the desired effect, to critique imperialism. Naturally, there were those who defended the Buccaneers. The first publisher of Buccaneers of America, Mr. Crook, appropriate name, yes, I make this joke every time, seems to have been unaware of how damning the crimes described were of him, and thought they were justified because they did it against the Spanish and to build up England. Many popular voices agreed, and critiqued Exquemelin for condemning the imperialism of others after what the Dutch did in the East Indies. Another publisher, Ayers, insisted that Morgan was a legal privateer, defended jingoistic imperialism, and although the Buccaneers couldn't pass for saints, they were incapable of committing the cruelties described by Exquemelin because they were, quote, contrary to the nature and temper of an Englishman, unquote. Oh my god. That's a good one. All in all, the book sparked a loud public discussion on England's attitude towards piracy and the role of the empire overall. The next wave of literature on buccaneers was rather strange, because it was written by a number of actual buccaneers who went on the same expedition to the Pacific. These works are strange because the writers make no effort to, despite the shifting public opinion, conceal any of their crimes. Instead, they rather gleefully admit their rampant plundering and, sometimes arbitrary execution of prisoners. Many of the hard incidents are written in an arrogant, cocky manner, with the writers trying to establish themselves as lovable rogues, so wacky, and the only ones they try to exonerate being themselves as individuals. I'm the good one, I'm cool. Funnily enough, one of the journals, when describing how the Buccaneers used prisoners as meat shields when assaulting a castle, make reference to Morgan's tactic described in Exquemelin, as if the author is saying, "Wow, look, it's just like in this other famous book." It must be remembered that these journals were edited, published, and possibly modified by London publishers, one of them literally named Hack. They just can't stop, seriously. So it is unknown to what degree they were modified. Despite admitting to their open piracy in these books, the Buccaneers were pardoned by Charles II, since they provided him with rare maps of the Spanish Pacific, which is why they were able to publish the books.
All in all, the books didn't exactly improve the views in the public of the Buccaneers. Their commander, Bartholomew Sharp, even ended up in a dictionary from 1690. Let's see here. A great cheat, also a huffing yet sneaking, cowardly bully, and a noted English buccaneer. Let's see here how buccaneer, West Indian pirates of several nations. Also, the rude rabble in Jamaica. That should probably tell you all you need to know about the attitudes towards the Buccaneers and colonials in general.
William Dampier was one of the Buccaneers, but he didn't get his literary breakthrough until 1697, with the publishing of A New Voyage Round the World. Compared to the Pacific journals, this one is relatively tame, mainly being a scientific journal on flora, fauna, and foreign cultures. However, there seems to be some attempt to exonerate the Buccaneers as a whole, not just Dampier as an individual. He rarely describes their engagements, treatment of prisoners, misdeeds, and always refers to them as privateers, even when they were obviously acting illegally. However, he does slip up on occasion, such as when he describes the execution of a black Spaniard for sending a fire ship against the Buccaneers. Dampier considered this to be a dishonorable trick, and the execution warranted. As a side note, we do have a Spanish travel account from a prisoner of Dampier's crew, Alonso Ramirez, and he does not paint nearly as pretty a picture, talking openly of the horrid tortures the Buccaneers deployed against their prisoners, such as feeding them feces. A new wave of journals were published during the War of Spanish Succession, not by Buccaneers, but by privateers seeking to condemn the Buccaneers, the old method of empire building, and to separate privateering from buccaneering. Woodes Rogers, the man later responsible for ending the Golden Age of piracy, critiqued the Buccaneers because they lived without government, how they squandered their plunder on liquor and gambling, and that the officers had no commissions. He believed that the true difference between buccaneers and privateers lay in culture, structure, and ethics. His colleague, Captain Cook, not a breadfruit guy, critiqued the published journals of the Pacific Buccaneers, saying how the writings are full of shameful actions, erroneous geography, faulty natural history, and the writers as cowardly scoundrels. Ironically, Cook and Rogers were both reliant on the experience of these buccaneers in navigating the Spanish Pacific. Dampier was even present aboard Rogers' ship as a navigator. Rogers pointed at buccaneering history as a disgraceful legacy, and he wished to present the privateer identity as a counterpoint to buccaneering. Privateers were orderly, honorable, and God-fearing. The book was highly influential, and would leave an impact on the maritime and imperial scene of Britain for the rest of the century. The 18th century privateer was a patriot, an auxiliary arm of the navy, and a commercial venture. In contrast, the Buccaneers had been a more direct tool in empire building that was used to great effect. England and France both used them to win their Caribbean empires, but once let loose, it was difficult to halt their excesses. In my opinion, the trend set by Tordesillas and the 17th century Buccaneers did not end until the American Revolution, but again, more on that in a bit. As the media landscape and popular opinion shifted against the Buccaneers, new political developments in the 1680s would put an end to the Anglo-French cooperation against Spain. Both France and England had spent most of the century competing against the Dutch Republic, the money-making chads of the 17th century. Both nations had implemented colonial trade restrictions with the Dutch, which only drove buccaneering and smuggling. In 1672, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange crashed, marking the end of the Dutch as an economic superpower. Meanwhile, France and England were slowly retracting their violence against Spain in favor of exploiting that nation economically. England by smuggling, whilst France was trying to establish a personal union, with the head of Louis XIV carrying both crowns. Between the four superpowers, two pieces were slowly etching towards the edge of the board, while France and England slowly moved towards a direct confrontation. In 1688, Charles II died. Charlie had been warming up both to Spain and Catholicism, and when it turned out that his successor, James, was an actual Catholic, Parliament chimped out and invited William, Stadtholder of the Netherlands, to become the new King of England. William could claim legitimacy through his wife, Mary, James's own daughter. That's kind of awkward. William went over and suddenly, the Dutch and English were allies. Dampier himself, when arriving in the Dutch East Indies, remarked with some surprise how gentle the once hostile Dutch suddenly were towards him. Meanwhile, Louis XIV had welcomed James I with open arms, supporting his claim to the throne. In 1689, the anti-French coalition declared war, and it would rage on for the next 9 years. Armed confrontations spread quickly to the Caribbean, and the colonies of Jamaica and Saint-Domingue, which for so long had benefited from the violence visited upon the Spanish, would now bear witness to that very same violence. A Dutch buccaneer who had aligned himself with the French, Laurens de Graaf, and had commanded and sailed with Englishmen as well, now descended upon Jamaica, burning plantations, taking slaves, butchering cattle, killing people, and displacing the rest. If the Frenchman or de Graaf himself ever felt too cocky, the English soon got their revenge when they landed on Saint-Domingue, taking out 600 Frenchmen and capturing 900 of them, including Laurens' wife and 2 daughters. The Buccaneers were at each other's throats. However, not many of them were so patriotic. In the 1680s, Jamaica had remarked how some buccaneers had taken to attacking English vessels, which were then sold at Saint-Domingue without interference from the authorities. During the English assault on Saint-Domingue, the Navy decided to press gang a great many sailors, causing many of them to flee to the French buccaneers. Perhaps there was still some sense of brotherhood between them. By now, however, many of the buccaneers had left the Caribbean altogether. But where had they gone? In some ways, the Buccaneers had contributed to their own irrelevance. By repeatedly sacking so many towns and harbors in colonial Spain, there wasn't much left to take anymore. Ever since the 1680s, the Buccaneers had started to make a shift away from attacking cities to increasingly going after ships. I mentioned how many of them in the High Period were poor sailors. By the late century, they had improved significantly, with Captain Sharp and his Pacific Buccaneers being the first Englishmen to cross the Cape of South America from the west, and sailing from Coquimbo to the Caribbean in 4 months. A move which even impressed Henry Morgan. Some Buccaneers had even begun attacking English vessels, showing that many of them had never been too patriotic in the first place. Meanwhile, New England preachers, unaware of this whole Enlightenment thing, kept preaching about drying up the river, killing heathens and stuff, and they implored the Buccaneers to sail east, where a whole new ocean awaited them. Islam was viewed as an even bigger threat than Spain, and former Buccaneers became pirates, operating out of Madagascar, attacking wealthy pilgrim ships before returning to New England. Even though they were outnumbered by the Mughals, who sat in ships many times larger, their combat expertise and marksmanship was often enough to win them the day, and the prizes they claimed were often many times more profitable than what even the Buccaneers could claim. The buccaneering phenomenon was a group of multinational pirates and privateers, fueled by religious and ethnic hatred, using state-of-the-art equipment, training and tactics to overpower and ransack Spanish possessions in the Caribbean, thus acquiring high-demand luxury goods that were difficult to acquire in any other way but violence. This means that historians struggle to place a definite end for the Buccaneers. Did it end in 1689 with France and England becoming enemies, ending their cooperation against Spain? Did it end in 1697, the last great attack on a Spanish port in which Buccaneers partook? It is hard to place a definite endpoint, because the Buccaneers did not disappear. They faded away. A war ended in 1697, shortly after which a Frenchman claimed the throne of Spain, shifting the European power dynamics once more. The countries were etching towards Louis XIV's dream of a personal union, and the coalition declared war again in 1701. Once more, old buccaneers from France and England both got aboard their ships to attack the enemy. For the French it was quite ironic, since they had spent so long raiding the Spanish, only to have their old sea dogs now escort the Spanish treasure fleet. The market they had previously only accessed through smuggling and buccaneering now lay wide open to them. To think that 4 years prior they had brutally sacked the city of Cartagena. This is often marked as the end of the buccaneering age, since the force was augmented by buccaneer auxiliaries. However, English privateers in the coming war would continue their attacks on the Spanish, in a manner undoubtedly inherited from the buccaneers. In 1702, a Jamaican force of 9 vessels and 530 men landed in the Gulf of Darien, where they were joined by 800 Cuna allies, just like the company of Captain Sharp. Many, if not most of these 530 men were undoubtedly old buccaneers, and the new recruits would be fueled by the stories of their glory days, and eagerly pick up the customs and tactics of their veteran companions. They marched inland and occupied the town of Santa Maria, seizing the gold mine, and afterwards proceeding to Panama. It is not known what happened to them. Meanwhile, French filibusters continued their attacks on Jamaica, even launching forays into the Portuguese towns of Brazil. In 1708, Woodes Rogers departed on his privateering cruise to the Spanish Pacific. Although he sought to reform the privateer's reputation with his book, the Caribbean privateers were far from what he envisioned. As shown by Dampier's book, Buccaneers and Pirates, in 99% or so of cases, called themselves privateers, publicly at least. They saw their actions as legitimate. Even those who attacked their fellow Englishmen likely had a grudge against the restrictive trade policies or deposing of the king, enough to warrant the title of privateer. It is unknown how many of them still call themselves buccaneers. We'll get to that in a bit. Nonetheless, it is obvious that there was a direct line connecting the very first buccaneers on Tortuga, the intrepid pig hunters, all the way to the Queen Anne privateers. Buccaneers like François L'Olonnais had been hunters. Morgan had hunters in his ranks. Sharp was a veteran of Morgan and used some of his tactics. Dampier, who sailed with Sharp, also served alongside an 84-year-old veteran of Cromwell and a Western design, and Dampier would go on to sail under Rogers. Dampier was friends with Henry Every, the greatest of the Red Sea pirates, and rumored to have been a buccaneer himself. His allies traded with Adam Baldridge, a former buccaneer that went on to run a trading post on Madagascar. There was a direct continuity of stories and traditions. In 1713, the War of Spanish Succession came to a close. A few of the old privateersmen could not lay down their arms and continued a private war against the French and Spanish. Their numbers only increased in the coming years, and this new breed of pirates, the Marooners, began attacking English ships. Not motivated by religion, politics seemed to have been their driving philosophy. A few years prior, the ruling dynasty had been deposed again, and many of the Marooners spoke openly of their restorationist ambitions. They were Jacobites. The rest of them were surely motivated by greed, the promise of easy riches, thinking they could sell their loot and retire as easily as the old buccaneers. It didn't end so well for many of them, mostly because they rarely managed to get enough loot. There must have been a significant number of old buccaneers among this generation of pirates. Many in the ranks were logwood cutters, a band of piratical lumberjacks harvesting dyewoods in Mexico, many of whom had retired from buccaneering in the 70s and 80s, and switched between piracy and woodcutting on a whim. Captain Charles Johnson, in his highly dramatized General History, makes passing mention of pirates with buccaneering backgrounds. Captain Charles Vane was arrested by an old friend of his, a veteran buccaneer named Hulford. In West Africa, a hideout was run by an old buccaneer named Crackers, who made dealings with scum like Bartholomew Roberts. Of the hideout inhabitants, Johnson wrote the following: "There are about 30 Englishmen in all, men who in some part of their lives have been either privateering, buccaneering, or pirating, and still retain and love the riots and humours common to that sort of life. One of the likely contributions that the Buccaneers made to the Marooners was the Jolly Roger, the famous skull and bones. Such a motif was first documented in Rover Hands in 1688, when a group of French buccaneers carried a red banner with a skull and bones. Black flags with skull and bones were then used by French buccaneers throughout the War of Spanish Succession, with the first visual depiction coming from a French flag book, attributing it to the filibusters. Trade policy is another under-discussed and likely cause behind the rise of piracy in the 1710s. For one, the English Royal African Company had been given a monopoly on selling slaves to the Spanish and the colonies, something which had previously been done by independent traders, smugglers, and buccaneers. There is a huge myth going around that the pirates liberated slaves when they captured slave ships, and whilst they did recruit black sailors, most of them born in the colonies, and used some slaves for menial labor, most of them were sold in the colonies, often clandestinely in Brazil or New Spain. Piracy was as much about trade as it was about theft. The English Navigation Acts, which had initially banned trade with the Dutch, had been extended to ban any colonial trade with nations other than the English. Far from being effective, it only served to anger the colonial citizenry, driving them into piracy and smuggling. That was the cat who wanted food. And yes, I did pause the recording so that I could go and feed him. Anyway, where were we? Piracy was soon realized to be ineffective. The old days were over. Most people disliked pirates, and there were now enough measures implemented to effectively hunt them. Smuggling, however, would not dissipate, but it became an honorable profession for any American worth his salt. England's restrictive trade policies became a major cause for the American Revolution, and its roots lie in the age of buccaneering. History has no beginning or end. It is a continuum. Trade policy and smuggling continued to be an issue for the remainder of the colonial era. Spain saw major reformation in the 18th century, including changes in her economic policy. Though they increased the efficiency of their interactions with their own colonies, they also became more restrictive towards foreign trade, leading to the War of Jenkins' Ear in 1739, during which England sought to extract more favorable trade deals from the Spanish. In some ways, this conflict harkened back to the old buccaneering age, when England sought to use buccaneers as an armed cudgel to expand their economic and territorial interests. Multiple invasions were launched, attempting to seize Spanish property. Notable was the failed assault on Cartagena. During this conflict, the Caribbean privateersmen are referred to as buccaneers. Undoubtedly, they were of the old marooners and privateersmen during the early 18th century. They were old men by now, and scarcely resembled their untamable ancestors. Relics of an age long gone, their time had passed. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.